Welcome back, everyone. It's the lawyer you know, and today we're going to take our first crack at the trucking accident that resulted in 4 deaths and 20 plus injuries in Colorado because the 26-year-old defendant who was driving that truck was just recently convicted and sentenced to 110 years in prison. We're going to talk about whether or not that sentence is fair, how it's possible he was sentenced to something similar to mass murderers in that state. We'll talk about who's to blame and if there's anything that can be done to fix it. So this story blew up in the news because millions of people are signing a petition to get his sentence, just to get clemency or to get his sentence commuted to time served and basically let this young man go who made a mistake, acted negligently, but did not intend to hurt or kill anyone, and ends up with basically a life sentence based on what he was charged with and how the consecutive sentences stacked up. So, Mr. Aguilera-Mederos is the gentleman's name who was driving the truck for a company that has had a lot of safety issues in the past that we'll talk about later in the video. But first, I want to go through all of the parties involved that could potentially be at fault, not necessarily at fault for the accident, but at fault for this miscarriage of justice to have such a heavy-handed sentence. But I also want to talk about whether or not this should be criminal at all as we go through the video. He was charged with over 40 counts, including 20 plus attempted assaults, 6 first-degree assault charges, reckless driving with serious bodily injury, 4 vehicular homicides for the deaths that occurred, which is basically, as you all know, because we've talked about it in other cases, is a negligent killing. So his negligent operation of a vehicle that resulted in death is technically a criminal charge for which he was charged and convicted. So I think 27 of those is what he got convicted on. I didn't follow the trial. I'm trying to get a lot of this stuff after the fact, which if you just Google this guy's name or you just Google this case, all you will find are cries for clemency, are cries for commutation of the sentences, are cries to let this man go because he's not a criminal. I don't necessarily agree with that. That doesn't mean I think this 110-year sentence is just, but I had to do a lot more digging than I should have to get to the actual indictment, crimes charge, and facts of this case. Everybody wants to jump on a story, and sometimes I think it's misguided, sometimes I think it's driven by the media, and sometimes I think people just want to be a part of the crowd and be a part of the echo chamber that says the same thing. Because as you look into this case, you can see why he was charged criminally. So now we're going to talk about who or what is potentially to blame for this overly harsh sentence. The number one culprit is the sentencing guidelines. We've talked about them in other cases, but there are minimum mandatories in certain states that don't give the judge discretion or even the prosecutor discretion to ask for less than whatever the minimum mandatory is. And that's what happened in this case. Because it was 23 plus felony convictions, the judge, I guess, had to run them consecutively, all of his sentences. So all these minimum sentences stacked up on top of each other consecutively versus concurrently, which would mean he could serve them all at the same time. We've talked about this in other videos, so hopefully you've checked those out. But if sentences run concurrently, you can have 25-year sentences, but it only ends up being 5 years that you have to serve. Consecutively would be 20 times 5. So obviously 20 times longer than just the 5-year sentence if they were to run concurrently. Judge said in this case his hands were tied. He had to run them consecutively based on the minimum mandatory. So the minimum mandatory sentencing guidelines are absolutely the number one thing to blame for this overly harsh sentence. But number two, the second person or group we're going to talk about that I think is majorly to blame here is the prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office has so much power in these cases. We talk about how they are supposed to find truth, seeking justice, get the just result, not just win. Well, the just result is not always just a conviction. Sometimes that is the just result, a guilty verdict. But it's a guilty verdict for the right crime charged that carries the right sentence and punishment for the actions taken by the defendant. And in this case, they could have chosen to charge the defendant with a number of things. Maybe one assault charge here. Definitely the 4 vehicular homicides, the reckless driving with serious bodily harm. Sure, they can pick and choose what they charge the defendant with and what they try him on, meaning take him to trial on what charges. They chose to charge this many different felonies, knowing that if they got convictions on these felonies, there would be these minimum mandatories, and he would end up going to prison for 110 years. So they can't act surprised at this overly harsh sentence. They stand behind their decision, and they stand behind their prosecution of this case, of this defendant, and of these charges. They have quotes like, "The defendant showed extreme indifference for human life." Based on the facts that I found out about this case that we'll talk about later when we talk about whether or not the defendant himself is to blame for this overly harsh sentence. But the prosecutors stand behind these charges and stand behind this conviction. Now, what's interesting is they said they wanted to talk plea deal. They went to the defendant. They made him offers and he rejected those offers. What do you think those offers looked like? For somebody that's been on both sides of those offers, I can tell you that there was compromise. The prosecutors didn't go offer 110 years. We talked about how that's common in certain federal cases where they have all the cards, they have everything stacked in their favor, and they win 99% of the time. They may go offer, you can take life or you can take life. But not in a case like this, where they knew there was going to be some blowback for negligent homicide, putting someone in prison for life. So I'm sure they made certain concessions. Maybe they said, if you plea to the negligent homicide, to the vehicular manslaughter, we'll give you X amount of years in prison. It was probably a lot, maybe 20 years, maybe 25 years, whatever it may be. But for a 20-year-old, that's only a quarter of your life, not life like 110 years. So they said they brought some plea negotiations to the table. They were all rejected, meaning we tried to give a fair and just result. He said no. Maybe he was rude, who knows? So they really took it to him. They took him behind the woodshed. They packed on these charges. The defense attorneys in this case said this is prosecutorial overkill, and I agree with them. There's no reason to go overboard on charges and sentences stacking up with minimum mandatories where a 26-year-old ends up in prison for the rest of his life for an accident, no matter how recklessly indifferent he was. That's just my opinion. We're not talking money. Take away all this guy's money, fine. Go as hard as you want, go as high as you want, fine with me. Take his money because he ruined these people's lives. But criminal punishment is different. Taking away life and liberty is different, in my opinion. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. And as we go through all of these potential parties or groups that are at fault for such an overly harsh sentence, I want you to put in the comments which one you think is most at fault. First, sentencing guidelines and minimum mandatory sentences. Second, prosecutor. And the prosecutors also made quotes like, well, we requested the minimum sentence for all these charges and all these convictions. Yeah, but they knew the minimum sentence had to be consecutive and was going to stack up to 110 years. So prosecutor, to me, is one of the major parties at fault. Third, the judge. We all know, if you've been listening to this channel by now, the judge determines the sentence, not the jury. So the judge is the one who literally and technically decided on the 110-year sentence. But we have quotes from the judge who basically said he disagreed with these minimum mandatory sentences and the sentencing guidelines, but said his hands were tied, and if it was up to him, he would not have given these sentences consecutively. He also said, after reading the victim impact statements, and what those are is the victims in a case have an opportunity to be heard by the judge and by the prosecutor's office, prosecutors in contact with these victims, and based on the statements made by these victims, the judge said many of them showed forgiveness. But they also did want this defendant to pay for the crimes that he had committed and the wrongs that he had done, but none of them seemed to think life in prison was appropriate. Prison sentences, sure, but not life in prison. So the judge himself is admitting he wishes he could do something about this sentence. Well, there may be a law in the state of Colorado that 180 days after the sentence, the judge can review it and see if it's too harsh. Now, I don't know, based on what I'm reading, it still doesn't seem like he can go around or circumvent the minimum mandatories. That seems like a sentence where he had some discretion. He said 210 years, and he says, you know what, I'll drop it down to the minimum 110 years. That's what it seems like to my reading, but maybe he'll be able to do something about it in 180 days. But it seems like this is something that's in the governor's seat or the legislature's seat or the politician's seat. Will they do something to change these minimum mandatories or pardon this guy based on this sentence? And is that even just? So next is the governor's office. Are they to blame because they haven't done something already to commute this guy's sentence? Which is basically all they can do is pardon him, give him time served. They can't necessarily say, no, I want to change and say this is the sentence he should get. Next, the trucking company. And the last two, I'll just give it away because we're going to talk about it here. The trucking company and then the defendant himself. Criminal liability is what we're talking about here. And who's at fault for this overly harsh prison sentence? The trucking company, who has safety complaints made in the past. They have been violated by having drivers that do not speak and read English appropriately enough to be able to be truck drivers because they have to be able to read the signs on the road and speak to people about directions and other things. And that's a federal law. And if you read into how Mr. Aguilera-Mederos gave his statement to law enforcement, he needed a translator for it. So this trucking company, who seems like a very small trucking company, I think they only had 5 trucks, seems like they have cut corners in the past, had safety issues in the past, and put truck drivers on the road that they should not have put on the road. Do they deserve some of this fault for the criminal liability and the overly harsh sentence? And last, and another person I think does have some fault here and did do a lot to add to this overly harsh sentence, and that's the defendant himself, the driver. There were videos that you can find of him driving erratically, cutting people off. One truck had to swerve off the road, right at a shoulder, on a mountain. He was changing lanes, driving in and out of lanes, weaving. And some of his testimony is that the brakes failed. There was nothing I could do. I was only going 45 miles an hour. I tried to make the least amount of damage possible when I decided where to kind of swerve. I closed my eyes and covered my face because I thought I was going to die. Some testimony from witnesses is that his eyes were wide. He looked scared right before the crash happened. But a lot of the videos and testimony was he was driving all over the place. He wasn't paying attention and he was speeding long before this accident happened. And most damning is that there's video of him passing an emergency truck exit, which if you've ever gone on a road trip and you've driven around these mountains, you see it has an exit where the truck can drive and you kind of go up the mountain so it stops the truck if the brakes fail or if there's ice or things like that. Exactly for this situation, that's why it's there, and he went right past it. Now, did he know about it? Was it an accident? Did he choose to? Was he not paying attention? That's why we have criminal negligence, because people have to be punished if they do something negligently and it kills 4 people and injures 20 plus more. So I don't have a problem with the fact that he's been prosecuted criminally personally. You may, and let me know in the comments if you do. I do have a problem with him being put in prison for life for an accident. But the fact that he missed that emergency exit and was driving erratically all over the road, we've all seen drivers that are weaving in and out, don't have a care in the world about everybody else on the road, and you're like, where are the cops now? Those are the thoughts we have. Well, the video to me seems like that's the kind of driver he was prior to this accident. Now, his testimony may be he lost control of it. You know, it was leaking, some people say, but then other experts say, well, there was air brakes, so that couldn't have affected the brakes just because it was leaking. It could have been a number of other things or condensation from the air conditioner. That doesn't prove anything. But based on the facts I've found, he clearly was negligent in causing this accident. But does he deserve 110 years? So if we switch gears and talk civilly, who do you think is civilly more at fault? Because in my opinion, when companies set employees up to fail, they are more at fault. And we have companies all the time who choose employees that are not qualified. If he couldn't read and write in English and couldn't speak English, they're setting him up to fail and they're putting everyone around him in danger. And it's not his fault. He's trying to make money. He's trying to work. He's doing the best that he can. But the company should have known he's not capable of doing this job. Were their trucks safe? Did they do the proper brake checks and all the testing? Because that costs money. Were they cutting corners, putting profits over people? Who was more civilly liable in these wrongful death claims and these injury claims? Do you think it's the company or do you think it's the driver? There's so much to unpack in this case. When we talk about petitions and we talk about clemency and we talk about commutation of sentences and sentencing guidelines and negligent crimes carrying serious criminal punishment. So tell me in the comments what angles of this case are most interesting to you, and I'll try to break them down further. Let me know if you're interested in this content by liking the video and subscribing to the page and putting in the comments that you want more about this case, because it's a truly tragic accident. People died, and now another young man's life is seemingly over if somebody doesn't step in to change it. I'm sure there's going to be appeals, and we'll see what happens, but I want to know from you, what is the most interesting part about this case, and what do you want to hear from me breaking it down in the future, if anything? So thanks for joining us for this new piece of content, and we'll be back with you next time on this channel breaking down the next case you're interested in. Thanks for watching this episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you like this content, please share it with your friends. Make sure you subscribe to our page and like our videos. If you want some interaction, get in the comments and we'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to know any more information about our firm or this page, you can find out in the description or visit tragoslaw.com. We post multiple times throughout the week, so make sure you hit that bell so you can get the notification and not miss out on the next episode.